Some crimes are so heartbreaking or shocking that they change laws, change society, or even earn the label crime of the century. But the stories that made headlines in decades past aren't necessarily remembered today. I'm Amber Hunt, a journalist and author, and in each episode of this show, I'll examine a case that's maybe lesser known today, but was huge when it happened. This is Crimes of the Centuries. This case was never huge in the media, but it should have been. It raises 1,000 questions about the difference between who we say we are and who we really are. It calls into question the precepts of our laws and the truth behind our humanity. It makes us confront fundamental beliefs that a lot of us still hold on to. It asks if we really are people who protect children, or if that's just plain bull. In the spring of 1944, while war still raged across the world, George Stinney Jr. was alleged to have killed 2 girls in his hometown of Alcolu, South Carolina. Alcolu encompassed just 4.5 square miles, and its population rested at just less than 500. That's still what it is today. It was a company town where almost everybody worked at the same lumber mill, bought their household goods and groceries from the same company store, and owed their safety and security and a reasonably good life to one family, the Aldermans. This is on par with the coal mining towns we've talked about in previous episodes. In company towns, the main business didn't just employ people, but they built the roads and the schools and subsidized the housing. It was a double-edged sword. People who lived there certainly felt a strong sense of community, but they also relied on a single source for not just their livelihoods, but for their, everything. If this sounds paternalistic, that's because it is, no question. But times were not always good, and this was a genuine safeguard against the too recent Depression-era phenomenon of rampant unemployment and hunger. The town was founded between 1885 and 1890 by D.W. Alderman, who built it along with his lumber business, his sawmill, his hotel, his cotton gin, his farm, and his store. The town was so reliant upon Alderman and his businesses that its very name included a nod to him. The first A.L. in Alcolu was a nod to Alderman. The coal, by the way, referred to a business partner and relative named Colwell, while the last part, Lou, was in homage to one of Alderman's daughters, Lula. Imagine being so powerful in a town that you get to name it. Anyway, D.W.'s son, Paul Repton Alderman, was in charge of the mill in the 1940s. He was a good man and a World War II veteran who, with his father and an uncle, earned a nod in the Greenwood, South Carolina Index Journal for donating $1,000 in goods to an orphanage, an act the newspaper praised as a quote-unquote noble thing. Paul R. was more or less fair and more or less enlightened, given the times. He employed white men as well as black men as skilled workers adept in the handling of heavy machinery, when a lot of employers felt that black men were not capable of that work. George Stinney Sr. was a grateful recipient of the Alderman largesse. He was black and employed as a skilled laborer in a time of great industry in the U.S. George Jr., one of his 4 children, was of slight build and was known to be a bit of trouble. What he is accused of doing, murdering and perhaps raping 2 girls, one 11, the other just 8, was nothing short of heinous. It may also have required the kind of strength and agility that were maybe not in his repertoire. On March 24, 1944, just hours after they had gone looking for some pretty flowers that some thought were meant for their church, the bodies of the 2 girls were found in a ditch, both of their heads badly crushed by some kind of pipe or railroad spike. The bodies had been covered by leaves, and the bicycle they had been riding lay crumpled on top of them. The unraveling of the whole thing was swift. George Jr. was picked up the next day. He was suspected only because he had spoken to the pair earlier when they stopped him and one of his sisters to ask if they knew where to find the blooms upon which they had set their hearts. Somebody apparently had seen that interaction and reported it to those looking for suspects. In short order, George Jr. and one of his brothers were taken away for questioning. John, the brother, was let go, but George Jr. remained. From Voices of the Civil Rights Movement.
Stinney was subjected to hours of interrogation without his parents or an attorney. The sheriff later claimed he confessed to the murders, although no written or signed statement was presented.
It was their word against his. To say that quote-unquote justice was swift would be a gross understatement. On June 16, 1944, exactly 83 days after the two young girls were brutally killed, George Stinney Jr. was asked if he had any final words. He replied, "No, sir." Then, according to press accounts gathered by Stanford University's Say Their Names project, George was asked to sit on a stack of books. This is Julian Johnson, a Black lawyer and activist from Chicago who has spent a lot of time on George Jr.'s case.
The electric chair was designed for adults and not children, and it was too large for George. George was so small that he had to sit on the Bible and books just to reach the execution mask.
His feet did not quite touch the ground when 2,400 volts of electricity shot through him. The mask over his face then slipped with the convulsive energy of the voltage, so that eyewitnesses could see his face contort in pain and tears run down his cheeks. A little before 8 in the morning that day, George Stinney Jr. breathed his last. He was 14 years old. Crimes of the Centuries is sponsored by Filter Easy. You know, Scott, I love owning my home. We can do such cool things to it.
Like build a movie theater in the basement?
Exactly. But the trade-off is that you have to keep tabs on so much home care stuff. It's a lot. Like, I'm supposed to change my air filters in both HVAC systems once a month. Well, it's time to remember that.
Yeah, but Filter Easy's making it easier, isn't it?
I see what you did there. It sure is.
Our Filter Easy filters arrived the other day, and it seems so straightforward. No more guessing sizes or running out of filters or living with dirty air.
Right, and our air here has the potential to get really dirty.
Seriously, we've got enough to worry about. Filter Easy checks one thing off the list for good. I mean, it's right in the name, Filter Easy. They're easy, they're quick, they're hassle-free, and they come with a dedicated team of over 200 employees across the country, so Filter Easy is ready to serve their customers with expert support.
You can also skip or cancel your subscription at any time. Filter Easy takes care of your air filters, so you have time to take care of everything else.
Head to filtereasy.com/COTC and use code COTC for 50% off your first order plus free shipping forever.
Once again, that's filtereasy.com/COTC for 50% off your first order plus free shipping forever. And make sure to use my promo code COTC so they know I sent you. George Junius Stinney Jr. was the youngest person legally, and with the full cooperation of federal, state, and local officials, to be executed in the United States in the 20th century. I make that distinction as we surely have incomplete records about how many children, Native American, Asian, Black, or white, who have been executed by way of burning, shooting, lynching, or starvation by various aggressors over our violent history. Still, George Stinney Jr. stands out. The teenager's trial had been public, as was its verdict and sentencing. There were voices of dissent, but fewer than you'd expect. The governor received a lot of mail during those short 3 months George Jr. was on death row, asking for a pardon or commutation of sentence for the teenager. A letter from Eliza Galt, sent in mid-June, read, quote, "South Carolina is my state, and I don't want it to be known as the state that executes children. end quote. But just as many South Carolinians urged the governor to get her done. One letter read, quote, "Why mercy for this rattlesnake," end quote. Julian Johnson again.
George's death sentence was actually not shocking considering the history of juvenile capital punishment in South Carolina. Between 1865 and 1972, all juveniles sentenced to death in South Carolina were black. The death penalty was almost exclusively reserved for black children, especially in cases involving white victims.
No wonder the news of the execution itself could not be found on the front page of the New York Times. It was on page 21, granted only 75 words, some brief tidbit they'd pulled from the Associated Press. Even the Chicago Defender, the renowned black-owned newspaper, moved George Jr.'s execution to page 18. Safe to say, the silence was deafening everywhere, but in Alcolu, where only 3 months before a shabby kind of amity had reigned. I'm sure I don't have to say this, but the Deep South in the 1940s was no picnic if you were black. The Civil Rights Act tried to change a few things, but that was still 20 years in the future. Of course, black lives still are in danger, and not just in the South. But in 1944, it was unclear if the Stinneys understood at all what their constitutional rights were. If they did, they probably knew those rights hardly mattered. Not well educated, but hardworking, the Stinneys maybe understood this was just another injustice and a really long line of them. That little corner of South Carolina, which lay midway between Columbia and Charlotte, had, for a time at least, been a marginal respite from a lot of the ills of the age. Tiny Alcolu had, to some, seemed a raggedy exception to the more extreme racism out there, or so some would later say. Workers of both races labored in the same mill, side by side, the argument went. They lived in close proximity to one another in a kind of peaceful coexistence.
Alcolu, South Carolina in the 1940s was a small segregated company town. Black families lived on one side of the railroad tracks while white families lived on the other. This economic divide deepened social and racial segregation, making black life even harder there.
Children were schooled in separate facilities, and the white school had twice as many teachers as the black school. The education of the black children usually ended around the 7th grade, though a company-provided bus would transport them to a technical school that saw them through the 10th grade. The white children, whose parents had higher expectations of them, were able to take a bus to the high school in nearby Manning, South Carolina. The races did not generally worship together, though from what I can gather, there didn't seem to be a hard and fast rule there. Socializing was usually not a mixed-race activity. As Eli Faber noted in his definitive book, The Child in the Electric Chair, the Alcolu lumber mill paid for medical treatment equally and handed out its seasonal Christmas baskets and gifts with no regard to what color the employee was. But it could hardly be a secret that the mill, on average, paid their white employees twice the annual salary paid to black employees. All made less than $1,000 a year, except for the few white upper management types who made a bit more than $2,000 annually. If you're curious, that would translate to about $36,000 in today's money. So no one was afforded a lavish lifestyle, but they were comfortable overall. After all, the mill covered their health care. All their benevolent employer asked in return was that the residents in its employ refrained from drinking, brawling, and causing trouble, that they kept their houses well maintained. The company fined you if you swerved from that directive, and rewarded you a nice sum of $10 if you had the most attractive front yard. Paul Alderman was the straight-laced, unbending authority figure in town. His nephew Ben was the nice guy to whom people brought their problems. Everybody in town rented houses from the company. The houses that white people lived in were painted. The houses that the black people lived in were not. Everybody had enough outdoor space to have gardens and maybe a cow and some chickens. White employees paid between $7 and $9 a month in rent, on average, depending on the level of job they held and the size of the house. Black employees, who lived in small homes, paid around $3. If you were unmarried and black, you got a shanty without a kitchen or sanitary facilities. But you also paid no rent for the shelter. The dividing line between the black and white living areas was, quite prosaically, the railroad tracks. So, no, it wasn't nearly utopian. It wasn't trying to be. But it was quiet, peaceful even, as long as the lumber mill dust could be kept in abeyance. All this is to say that nobody was rich, except if your name was Alderman, and, all facts considered, it was better in Alcolu than in a lot of South Carolina towns if you were looking for some kind of racial harmony. That is, until that March day when the girls went missing. Crimes of the Centuries is sponsored by Wild Grain. Wild Grain is the first baked from frozen subscription box for sourdough breads, fresh pastas, and artisanal pastries. Scott, you know how much I like Wild Grain.
I do. You made something from Wild Grain the first time I came over to hang out.
I did. They were great then, and I swear they're getting better by the day. Their boxes are now fully customizable to your tastes and dietary restrictions. So they've got their classic variety box, which is the one I used back then, but now they have a gluten-free box and a plant-based box that's 100% vegan.
Everything I've tried from them is great, but their specialty is sourdough bread. And you know I love me some sourdough. It's quality bread.
It is. With Wild Grain, every item bakes from frozen in 25 minutes or less with no thawing required.
That's amazing.
Are you ready to bring all your favorite carbs right to your doorstep? Be sure to check out Wild Grain so you can begin building your own box of artisanal breads, pastas, and pastries. For a limited time, you can get $30 off the first box, plus free croissants in every box when you go to wildgrain.com/COTC to start your subscription. You heard me! Free croissants in every box and $30 off your first box when you go to wildgrain.com/COTC.
That's wildgrain.com/COTC, or you can use promo code COTC at checkout.
Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames, 11 and 8 respectively, were like most kids in that day and age, able to roam around the countryside at will with the barest of parental oversight. On this day, they decided to borrow some scissors and go cut wildflowers. The flowers they were after were purple and had the poetic name of maypops, and grew next to the railroad tracks, which meant the girls had to wander over to the side of town they were least familiar with. Alcolu resident Sadie Duke would later say,
"They were very sweet girls."
The story goes that Betty June and Mary Emma met George and his younger sister Amy while journeying to find the flowers, even stopping to ask them if they knew where the maypops were blooming. George and Amy, who were tending their cow Lizzie, did not offer them any ideas, and the two sets of children went on their merry ways. Years later, Amy and her older sister Catherine would testify that George then took the cow back to their home, fetched her some water, and put her back in the shed. They maintain that George then returned home with them to wait for their mother, who was not the kind of woman who let her children laze about the countryside unsupervised. When she returned later that Friday afternoon, the whole family went to a party in the neighborhood where George was in attendance. By about 4:30, when Betty June's mother got home, she was dismayed that the two little girls had not returned home. She called the sheriff, and by the time it got dark, most everybody in town knew that the girls were gone, and at least 100 or so Alcolu residents had taken to the countryside looking for them. The little party that the Stinneys were at got word that the girls were missing, and George Sr. and his sons joined the search. George Jr. must have mentioned to someone during the search that he had spoken to the girls that morning in passing, cow in tow. Soon enough, the men who had membership in a few nearby town civic groups like the Lions and Masons heard the call and got themselves to Alcolu to beat the bushes, the swamps, the abandoned buildings, and the mill for any sign of the girls. The search continued through the night. Near dawn, 16-year-old Francis Batson found the girl's bicycle in a ditch. Under it, he found two bodies, both with ravaged faces, their heads savagely bludgeoned. Later, it would seem there was some difference in recalling exactly who, either a state policeman named Sidney Pratt Or Deputy Sheriff Huger Newman walked the streets in the black part of town and chatted with someone who claimed that George Stinney Jr. was, quote, the meanest fellow in this community, end quote. In either case, the someone who gave the tip was never identified publicly. He is referred to in documents as John Doe, with a note that divulging his name would be dangerous to him. I'll say, as a reporter who's investigated a number of wrongful convictions, this gives me pause. Trooper Pratt was not inclined to follow the vague suggestion, but Deputy Sheriff Newman convinced him to go with him to visit the Stinney home. When the pair got there, Pratt was walking around the house when he supposedly heard George say to a cousin, "Well, you will not tell on me." That did it. Pratt and Newman asked George and his brother John to accompany them to the Clarendon County Jail to talk. John was released after not saying much, and George was supposedly told he was in, quote, deep trouble, end quote, and that there was only one man who could help him now. No, it wasn't Jesus, it was Mr. Alderman. It was now that, according to Pratt, George must have figured that Alderman was so powerful he would fix everything. So, Pratt said, George Jr. changed his story, going from saying he had not done it to admitting he had killed the girls with a piece of pipe. I'm not going to stop the narrative for long right here, but there appears to be nothing in the record that explains how long George was held or under what circumstances. There is no adult figure present in the room with him, other than those who are anxious for a confession. That's right, no parent, no pastor, no attorney. There is, most importantly, no written or signed statement of the confession as given that day in the sheriff's office. So let's review. A 14-year-old was the only black person in the room, never a comfortable situation down south in 1944, and was thrown what seemed like a lifeline with the mention of an alderman waiting to help. I got questions. Had he been threatened, starved, sleep-deprived? Julian Johnson has a stance.
George, being only 14, was coerced into confessing to the crime. He later recanted, but it didn't matter because the police had what they needed to move forward with George's unjust prosecution.
Of course, that's speculation. No one can truly know. There's no record of how long or under what circumstances the chat took place. There's no record of George Jr. being asked to explain the circumstances. Was he told he'd be spared if he confessed? That still happens today, so I wouldn't be surprised if it happened in 44. If he did confess, did he understand the consequences of doing so? Or did he simply think he could go home now, having given them what they so desperately wanted? It's all plausible in my book. The two lawmen were satisfied, though. They said they then took George Jr. to the ditch where the girls had been found. He's said to have fished around a bit in the stilled water to find the piece of pipe that he said had been the murder weapon. Nobody took a picture of the find. No one else confirmed the ditch hunt. But word of either the confession or the trip to the ditch started to travel from house to house in Alcolu. Tempers were igniting. It got worse with further embellishment. Sometime during his time with the cops, George Jr. allegedly told Pratt and Newman that he, quote-unquote, fooled with one of the girls after he had hit her. In fact, he tried to do so twice, he said. The second time, apparently, after he knew she was dead. Imagine what the locals were thinking. Not only were two young girls dead, killed in a violent fashion, but they were hearing a 14-year-old boy was describing sexually assaulting the 11-year-old twice, including once post-mortem, and happily talking to the cops about it. Again, there's no documentation of this supposed description. Pratt and Newman either heard this from George Jr.'s mouth and failed to have him write it out or sign a confession, or they made it up. Either way, they surely knew that any sexual component to this crime would only stoke ordinary men to extraordinary lengths to get vengeance. And it did. Serious talk began about a lynching mob stepping in to save the state the trouble. Ben Alderman, now on behalf of his family, tried to settle things down, traveling to where George Jr. was held and talking to authorities. He then went back to Alcolu, found George Sr., and told him to gather up his family immediately and leave town on the next train. Nobody wanted a lynching, least of all the people whose town was being ripped apart. They said they would try to help George Jr. to safety before a lawful trial, but they worried that the whole family might be burned out or killed by their white neighbors. It's worth noting that somewhere in all this chaos, George Sr. was officially fired from the mill. Either way, George Sr. packed up his family in a rush and headed out of town to the home of some relatives. From a piece by Daily News Blast.
They left. They never saw George again.
George Jr. was moved by the two lawmen to the farther outpost of the Sumter County Jail to hide him from the mob they knew was forming. The world had caught up to Alcolu pretty fast, and the gentle balance of life there went out the window just as quickly. Every imaginable horror that Southern white men could feel about the death of young girls was now on the table. Quick as he could, the coroner issued his report on the girls' autopsies. He most notably cited the brutal injuries to both of the girls' heads, but he made a point of underlining that there was very little evidence of bruising elsewhere. In the younger girl, there were no bruises or discoloration around her genitalia, and her hymen was intact. In the older girl, there was a slight bruise on the right side of her genitalia, perhaps caused by falling off the bike, and her hymen was likewise intact. In other words, the coroner said, neither had been raped. In South Carolina, in 1944, this much was clear. No one under the age of 7 could be charged with a crime. 16 was determined to be the age of responsibility for a crime. That left a gap between 7 and 15 that yawned wide enough to drive a truck through. So the Clarendon County prosecutor leaned hard on family court precedent, which held that anyone between 14 and 16 could be charged and tried as an adult in a capital offense. And the punishment for that offense, even if it included death, was justifiable. Charges were thus filed in the girls' deaths. Despite the fact that the county contained a substantial percentage of black residents, an all-white grand jury was impaneled and went on to indict George Stinney Jr. of 2 murders. Not rapes, mind you, but murder. The trial for the murder of Betty June, the elder girl, was set to begin April 21, 1944, a month after the deaths. Not to be crass here, but flowers on the girls' graves were still fresh. Still, when his legal counsel, something provided indigent defendants as a matter of course for major crimes, was asked if he had been given enough time to prepare, he said he had. The trial took less than 3 hours. The prosecutor put the 2 confessions, supposedly given by George Jr., into the record. One of those had the younger girl, Mary Emma, falling into the ditch and George Jr. rescuing her, or trying to, only to have Betty June attack him. He then had to defend himself and, well, it turned out badly. The other had him killing Mary Emma to get her out of the way so he could force himself on Betty June, who ran from him. He was then forced to hit her as well with the spike or pole or pipe he had used to put away Mary Emma. Everybody went into the ditch where the sexual assault was attempted, according to that version. Again, this was supposedly part of George Jr.'s confession, even though it wasn't substantiated by the coroner's findings and wasn't part of the charges. A few people were put on the stand to establish chronology of the events before the girls went looking for flowers. Then came Newman and Pratt, the investigators, to highlight the main points of the confession they said they had heard. The defense did not ask a single rebuttal question. The doctor, who had said there was no sign of sexual assault, waffled on that point. The defense did not probe his testimony. There was no physical evidence to present, so that saved time. The defense, when it was its turn, did not call a single witness. A present-day South Carolina judge, Carmen Mullen, looked back.
One of the most shocking things in the George Stinney case is he was tried by a jury of 12 white men. That certainly is not a jury of his peers. That's certainly not a cross-section of Clarendon County at the time, which was half African-American, half white. And here we have an all-white jury with his family not being even allowed into the courtroom.
The jury was out for all of 10 minutes. They had taken a vote without even discussing the case, and they found no need to discuss it after a unanimous decision as to George Jr.'s culpability, so they spent the rest of the time filling out the necessary papers for the judge. Judge Philip Stoll then sentenced the 14-year-old boy to die on Friday, June 16, 1944, less than 2 months away. He saw no need to dawdle. Twice before George Stinney was electrocuted, boys his age had been given the same sentence in South Carolina, but in neither case had the sentence been implemented. George Jr. didn't get the benefit of whatever doubt existed for those two teenagers, hence his history-making status. In 1972, in the landmark case Furman v. Georgia, the United States Supreme Court mandated that the death penalty be suspended because it was handed out in an arbitrary and inconsistent manner. In 1976, it clarified its ruling, declaring that meaningful appellate review was a necessary prerequisite to any death sentence being carried out. But yeah, states could impose death again, and many revised their statutes to comply, and again, we are happy to mete out the punishment. This supposedly made for a less arbitrary, if uneven and by no means fair, much less perfect, use of the penalty. According to the Death Penalty Information Center, while Black Americans compose about 12% of the population, they represent 35% of the people executed in this country. And Black defendants are more likely to receive the death penalty when charged in crimes similar to those committed by white defendants. By 1984, the average time between the levying of a death sentence and the actual execution was 74 months, or a little more than 6 years. In 2000, the average lapse was 137 months, or close to 11 and a half years. Today, the average time between a sentence of death and the fulfillment of that sentence is, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, around 19 years. Further research, done again by the Death Penalty Information Center, tells us that more than half of those exonerated since 2013 have taken 25 years or more to do so. George Stinney Jr. got 56 days. Now, George Jr. was no choir boy. In fact, his mother once went to Ben Alderman deeply worried because she could do nothing with the boy, as he would not pay her or his father any mind. She told her boss that he was unmanageable. It's even alleged that, on the day before he supposedly killed those two little girls looking to pick flowers, he'd stabbed another child at school, injuring but not grievously harming him. Sadie Duke, whose voice you heard earlier in this episode, even said she'd heard him threaten a friend of hers.
This black boy came down there. He came up to us and he wanted to know, what were we doing down there? I said, we came to get some water and we just got to playing down here. He said, well, if you don't get away from here and if you come back, I will kill you.
He was also known to steal now and then and exhibit several bouts of uncontrolled aggression, beating up all comers, white or black, all of which might be relevant or not at all. You might well ask if anyone questioned his intelligence or his sanity. The answer is yes to the first issue, but everyone knew he'd made it to the 7th grade, and it was successfully argued among the locals that that was not the mark of a stupid child. So no, it was not brought up by his attorneys. On the latter issue of Sanity, it appears George's legal defense team never even considered it might be arguable. Local lawyers James Weidman and Charles Plowden had both been assigned the case without much regard for their desire not to be. Weidman was, according to reports at the time, a tax attorney who had never argued a criminal case. And what of arguing that his age mattered? That a child of 14, at the cusp of puberty, hormones a mess, and without supervision, might have difficulty knowing the difference between right and wrong? That's a tough one to sell. These days, it's generally accepted that by age 14, children have developed a strong sense of morality, understanding not only what is right, but understanding the consequences of doing wrong. Do children vary in this ability? Yes, they do. But psychologists today believe that right and wrong are concepts that begin to develop as early as age 3 or 4. In the legal system now, the age where the right-wrong standard is applied is between 7 and 15, depending on where you live. Not too tidy. Maybe that's why Weidman and Plowden opted against it. Truth is, they opted against a lot of possible paths that, if taken, may have altered George Jr.'s fate. Kathleen and Amy, George's sisters, had said he was with them all afternoon. They were never called to testify. In fact, no Black resident of Alcolu was allowed in the courtroom, save for George Jr., who sat alone. The horrific crime scene indicated that the person who killed the 2 girls would have been covered in blood. Where were the clothes that George was supposed to have worn when he bludgeoned them to death? Did no one see him on his way home, awash in fresh blood? It piques the question, did George Jr. get competent representation? Hardly. If their trial wasn't shameful enough, no appeal on George Jr.'s behalf was ever made on any grounds. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, had little representation in that region of South Carolina, a possible reason for their lack of influence or vigor in this case. They did plead with the governor to stop the execution, citing his age as mitigation.
Governor Johnson was running for a U.S. Senate seat against a staunch segregationist named Cotton Ed Smith. He did not want to appear as to be siding with Black people or being soft on race issues, so he did nothing. Johnson dismissed the appeals and emphasized the crime's brutality and deferred responsibility to the judge and the jury. He used George's execution to appeal to his electorate to enforce his commitment to white rule in South Carolina.
Alternately, he tried to placate his critics by saying that the result was out of his control, putting it back on the justice system. So even the governor perpetuated lies about the rape and what was actually in his control to mitigate. It would seem that the only thing that pinned the teenager to the ground was a confession. Work on false confessions would not really begin until the 1980s, when forensic psychologists began to study it. They found that suspects can be so severely stressed by interrogations that they confess to crimes they haven't committed. George Stinney Jr.'s family eventually began to push for exoneration in 2006 to a muted non-response from South Carolina. That lasted until 2013, when Clarendon County Attorney Steve McKenzie read about the case and wondered why he'd never heard the story before. He'd grown up in the county and had been in practice for 20 years, and this was all news to him. He told the Center for Public Integrity, quote, "As a lawyer, I was appalled at the lack of due process that was given to George Stinney," end quote. In October of that year, and what he expected would be a symbolic attempt at best, he asked the county solicitor to give George Jr. a new trial. McKenzie looked hard and found that in 2009, Amy Stinney Ruffner had talked to a reporter from the Sumter Item and explained that her brother George could not have killed those girls, as he had been with her the entire day. But the family, so deeply brainwashed by the inequalities of the South and so terrified of what might happen to them, figured, in her words, to just leave it be. As the decades passed, she changed her mind.
It was a wrongful killing. He was too young. First of all, they didn't give him a chance.
So, in 2013, through the lawyer McKenzie, the Stinney family filed a petition asking that George Jr.'s conviction be overturned. Sumter County Circuit Judge Carmen Mullen held a 2-day evidentiary hearing to determine if George Jr. had gotten a fair trial. George Jr.'s sister was able to tell the judge what she had told a reporter about her brother's whereabouts that day. In December 2014, Judge Mullen vacated George Jr.'s conviction. She said he had been denied the due process he was legally entitled to as an American citizen. Here she is, talking to the Daily Blast.
We don't know whether or not he did it, but that wasn't the issue. It was whether or not his constitutional rights were preserved, and they weren't, and that was clear. And the further I got into it, the more I saw just how obvious and blatant it was that he wasn't afforded his constitutional protections.
25 years earlier, the Innocence Project had launched, and a lot of DNA testing was being done on those in prison who claimed they had been wrongly found guilty. According to the project's data, they found that 25% of exoneration cases involved a false confession. Further research in 2006 showed that some who believe that their innocence will be evident soon enough often confess simply to be allowed to go home. That work has changed the face of testimony in this country, with experts willing to weigh in on the accused's behalf. But we haven't come as far as you think. Requirements to tape or videotape confessions vary widely from state to state. According to Casecracker, a company that specializes in audio recording, a little more than 50% of states have passed legislation or voluntarily committed to recording police interviews, but conditions in which they do so fluctuate from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Only 4 states, Alaska, Arkansas, Minnesota, and Montana, require that all interviews for all offenses be recorded. Every other state adheres to those requirements for specific crimes. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, by the way, is still not legally required to tape confessions. In Alcolu, the before contrasted sharply with the after. After George Jr.'s execution, things kind of fell apart. Less than 3 years later, the D.W. Alderman and Sons Company was sold to Southern Coatings and Chemical Company and to the Williams Furniture Company. Its remaining land was divvied among the family. The former company and most of its land was eventually bought by Georgia Pacific, which carried on until 2000, finally closing the mill. In 2004, Catherine Stinney Robinson, George Jr.'s sister, and Lorraine Bailey, the sister of Betty June Binnicker, spoke to StoryCorps. The first woman to speak is Bailey.
Everybody knew that he'd done it even before they had the trial. They knew he'd done it. But I don't think they had too much of a trial.
I remember Mother cried so. She cried, her little eyes all swollen. I would hear her praying. She said, I just want you to change the minds of men. Because my son didn't do this. But it wasn't long after that they just did it. And he was gone.
I think if he was able to kill 2 people, he didn't have any business to be living. If he got away with that, next time he probably would have killed 3.
I remember going to the funeral. I couldn't believe what they had done to that little boy. I'll never forget the way he looked.
Well, I think about it all the time. I got a picture over there. She was a real pretty little girl. She had dark brown hair, dark brown eyes. She was just a darling baby.
He was like my idol, you know. He was very smart in school, very artistic. He could draw all kinds of things. We had a good family, a small house, but there was a lot of love. It took my mother a long time to get over it, and maybe she never got over it.
The trial transcripts from the Stinney trial, the police reports, and the accompanying records and files were not much help in Judge Mullen's hearing, as they had been lost. All that's left are some handwritten notes and a newly erected, relatively speaking, headstone for George Jr., who for years had been buried in an unmarked grave along Calvary Church Road in Pinewood, South Carolina. The one that stands today reads, "Wrongfully convicted, illegally executed by South Carolina, conviction vacated by court order, dated December 16, 2014. To research this case, journalist Amy Wilson read The Child in the Electric Chair by Eli Faber. She read the work done on the case by students at both Stanford and Harvard universities, as well as some of the newspaper reportage at the time in the Columbia Record, the Charleston News and Courier, and the Greenville News. The websites that chronicle the death penalty and exonerations were also useful. Crimes of the Centuries is available early and ad-free through Grab Bag Collab. Join us at patreon.com/GrabBagCollab to hear not just exclusive content related to this show, but to also get access to several other shows on our profit-sharing network. Unless noted in the citations, this case was researched and written by me, Amber Hunt, and produced by Amanda Rossman and Henry Lavoie. Original music is by Bruce Hunt, Andrew Higley, and occasionally by my son, Hunt Van Ben Scoten. Other music comes from Soundstripe and Epidemic Sound. If you like the show, help us out by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts. For more information or to recommend a case, go to centuriespod.com. On Instagram, we're at centuriespod, and check out our Crimes of the Centuries podcast Facebook page.